Okay, everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about courage. And when we look at the female leadership competencies, for those of you that have been with us this whole time, we're glad you're back. For those of you that haven't, let me give you a brief recap of where we've been. So, we started by talking about self advocacy, the ability to speak up for ourselves, the ability to advocate for our needs, our ambitions, our priorities, our boundaries, to be able to speak up. And, a lot of this and so much of this has to do with the way that we're socialized to not speak up for ourselves. Last week, we talked about self awareness. Self awareness is really about understanding and doing introspection about who we truly are. And there's lots of interesting research about self awareness. What I've really sort of discovered the more we dig into these female leadership competencies based on the conversations we've had with female leaders is this, that self-awareness really is the keystone competency for everything, that everything sort of branches off of self-awareness, courage being no exception. You know, self-awareness really is tied to our ability to advocate for ourselves. Self-awareness is really tied to our ability to take risks and make courageous decisions and be authentic and ask for the things that we need. And, there's all of these places that self-awareness really connects when it comes to all of these female leadership competencies. And as we talk today about courage, I think that there's an important component of self-awareness that plays into our ability to exemplify courage. Now, when we talk about courage, and when I say courage is a female leadership competency, most people sort of default to the obvious things. Acting courageously, being bold, speaking up, advocating for what you need, asking for help, like all of these things. And so much of that stuff, that type of courageous leadership really is rooted in self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is really about speaking up. Self-advocacy is really about asking for help. Self-advocacy is really about setting priorities and boundaries for yourself. When we talk about courage, courage is really about the propensity for risk taking. So here's what's interesting. In our conversations with female leaders, so many of them referenced taking risks. So many of them referenced making big leaps in their career, whether it was changing trajectories, changing industries, changing professions, going from a big company to a small company, starting their own company, like all these really big risks that they've taken. And as that theme started to emerge, I really wanted to understand, like, is this unique to these female leaders, or are women good at taking risks? And as we looked at the existing body of research around courage, what I discovered was that women really aren't predisposed for risk taking. And in fact, we're sort of conditioned and socialized to not take risks. We're conditioned and socialized to play it safe. We're conditioned and socialized to be careful and to be safe. And I think about my childhood, and I think about the way I was raised as a girl, but also the way that I'm raising my daughter. And I've really started to realize that we really socialize women this way from a very young age, to be careful, to play it safe, to not take risks. And we really embrace risk-taking behaviors in boys, which is so interesting to me. I have a 5-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son. And when I think about the way that I interact with them and the way that we embrace risk-taking or don't embrace risk-taking in my son versus my daughter is actually pretty alarming to me. And I've started to become really conscious to those things where, my son will like jump off a bookshelf and it'll be like, oh, boys will be boys. Like on Christmas, for instance, my kids got Santa Claus brought them bikes this year for Christmas. And my son didn't have a bike helmet because he didn't really have like a bike until this Christmas. And so Santa brought him a bike helmet, and it was like one of those really crazy, kind of weird bike helmets that had like the spike mohawk in the middle, and it was like this kind of fun dinosaur on the side. And so he didn't want to take it off all day. And he intentionally, while wearing his bike helmet, threw himself down the stairs as if to test said bike helmet on Christmas. And when it happened, my husband and I were like, "Whoa, crap!" And then, we were telling our parents about it, and we were telling some other people, and they're like, "Oh, that's a boy for you." And I had this moment of like, would we say that if that was our daughter? Would we assume that our daughter fell, or would we assume that she threw herself down the stairs? And I think so much about the way we socialize, boys versus girls, in our society sets us up for a propensity for risk taking, or a hindrance for risk taking. And when we look at women and the way they're socialized, I think in a lot of regards, we are we are socialized to not take risks. And so when we look at these leaders, and I hear them specifically talk about the risks that they have taken in their lives, the risks that they have taken in their careers, and how they've consciously evaluated those risks, I thought that that was really an important competency, an important theme to shed light on. And to really look at, okay, if women are not predisposed for risk taking, what are the things that we can do as women to be better at taking risks? I think about a lot of these instances of these women we've talked to, female entrepreneurs who started their own company, women who left really great careers and totally pivoted to a totally different career, women who got fired from a job and did something completely different. Just all of these really important things that these women did and how they took risks. And then I specifically think about Cindy Stellhorn, one of our Ladies Leading interviews, and she works in insurance. I mean, she was an underwriter for many years of her career. And when we asked her, what's the one thing that women need to be successful, her response was to take risks. And she's like in the risk business. And for her to say that was really sort of this moment for us of like, oh, this is a really important theme that we need to draw some light to for women. So I've done some reading about how to be better at taking risks. And to be honest with you, there's not a lot of great information out there about risk taking. And the risk taking advice is actually pretty superficial. They talk about like, oh, check in with your friends and, oh, evaluate carefully. Well, no crap. I mean, like, if you're already predisposed to not take risks, you're probably going to over evaluate carefully for any risks that you take for your future. But I think for women, when it comes to risk taking, I think for so many of us, we have sort of this analysis paralysis where we analyze it too much, and as a result, never actually take action on most of the things. I think about, in my last job, I had known for about 2 years that it was probably time for me to leave. And me leaving that job was a pretty big risk. And I analyzed and overanalyzed and overanalyzed that decision to death until I was sort of earthquaked out of the organization, or earthquaked into making the decision to leave the organization, I should say. And I think for so many of us, those risks that we want to take and deep down feel like we want to take, we often don't take because of fear, because we overanalyze it, because we're really sort of tied to safety and tied to being careful, and that is the way that we're predisposed. What I did find in the research about taking risks was actually one thing that I found extremely helpful, and that was around negativity bias. So negativity bias is essentially that we overanalyze and overestimate the negative risks associated with making a decision, and we underestimate and underanalyze the positive potential outcomes of a decision that we might make or a risk that we might take. And that women are more naturally predisposed to negativity bias because we're naturally predisposed to not take risks. And so when we evaluate decisions, we often overplay the negative consequences and underplay the positive potential outcomes. And so some of the work that we can do around having greater courage and a greater propensity for risk taking is to really reflect on negativity bias. And so as we're weighing decisions, maybe to force ourselves to come up with options that explain positive outcomes of a decision and come up with more options of positive outcomes than we have negative consequences. And that there's a way that we can sort of override that social conditioning in the way that we evaluate risks. You know, I think so much of that is about self-awareness, right? So having an awareness to the fact that maybe we overestimate the negative consequences of things and underestimate positive potential outcomes, and being able to override those systems that naturally occur for us is an important piece of self-awareness as a leader. You know, whether they be personal decisions or whether they be organizational decisions. I think about female leaders in organizations. There were a lot of times where I was pushed to make a decision and often erred on the side of caution, erred on the side of safety because, I overplayed some of the negative potential outcomes as opposed to some of the positive outcomes. And so looking at negativity bias really can be one of those places that allows us to sort of, you know, evaluate how we can be more courageous. There's this quote by Mark Zuckerberg. I don't love quoting Mark Zuckerberg, but there's this quote by Mark Zuckerberg that says, "The biggest risk is not taking any risk. In a world that's changing really quickly, the only strategy that is guaranteed to fail is not taking risks." And I thought that was a really important sort of moment for us to look at as women, is to think about, okay, the biggest risk is not taking risks for us. I mean, when we think about our ascension into leadership and our advancement in our professions and our ability to shatter glass ceilings, the bigger risk is not taking risks. Because when we don't take risks, we get lapped. We get lapped by men, we get lapped by other talented females that are willing to take risks, we get lapped by other people. And I think that we've got to be willing to sort of look at some of that negativity bias. The other piece, I think, is, to look at failure. We're going to talk about failure when we talk about resilience as well, but courage and resilience are really so interconnected, it's hard to talk about them separately. There's this fear of failure that so many leaders have, and I think that it's so deeply connected to courage. And if we want to take risks, we can't really be afraid of failure. And such a big piece of the resilience component of our leadership competency isn't necessarily about failure. It's about bouncing back from that failure and using that failure as a learning opportunity, and a learning opportunity that propels us forward. And that's the piece that we really latched onto for the female leaders that we were talking to, is their ability to fail, use that failure as a learning opportunity, and then that learning opportunity really propelling them forward in careers. And so, risk taking and failure can be closely connected with one another. And so I think, we've got to evaluate decisions that are based in fear versus decisions that are based in facts and data and intuition. We're also going to talk about intuition as well. But, so much of these fear-based decisions, I think, come from what people often call a scarcity mentality instead of an abundance mentality. And I've been doing a lot of work around scarcity versus abundance mentality personally for myself. people who have trauma in their lives, or have experienced trauma in some regard, whether it be in work or life or their upbringing or at some point in their lives, often a trauma response is to have sort of this survival mentality or a scarcity mentality where they're constantly in survival mode and they're constantly making fear-based decisions. And when people come from a abundance mentality, and when we make decisions from abundance mentality, we don't often make decisions based in fear. We make decisions based on opportunities. And I think that's the other piece of courage, is to really evaluate, are we making decisions that are rooted in a scarcity mentality or based in fear, versus are we making decisions based on an abundance mentality and based in optimism? And using those opportunities to understand what's worst case scenario. What is the worst thing that could happen? And is it really that awful? So looking at, if I fail, what does failure look like? And using that as an opportunity to evaluate risks. I think we often, when we evaluate risks, we look at, you know, uh, I'm going to fail, and not I'm going to succeed. But we have to evaluate it, I think, from both perspectives, looking at, they call it a pre-mortem. If I was to succeed, what would that look like? We do a lot of that work, I think, in business. But we never really, I think, and have an opportunity to look at, if I fail, what does that look like? And to do a pre-mortem evaluation of maybe what failure might look like. And I think when we do a pre-mortem of what failure might look like, it doesn't often seem as scary, and it doesn't often seem as terrible as maybe we imagine it in our heads without putting it down on paper. So when we look at courage, I think we can look at two things. We can look at overcoming our negativity bias, operating from a place of abundance as opposed to a place of scarcity, and really looking at failure as an opportunity to learn and grow, but also that it probably isn't as bad as we think it's going to be. I think ultimately, when we looked at the leaders we talked to, they had found a really great way to evaluate risk and to feel comfortable and confident making those risks and taking those risks for themselves. And what we found is that every leader we talked to had taken some level of risk at some point in their career, and that those risks, whether they failed or succeeded in those things, paid extreme dividends for them in their careers. And so it's not necessarily whether those risks and the outcomes of those risks were positive. It was a matter of them taking them, and that those things still, whether they failed or succeeded, were positive outcomes for them. So, wanted to talk about courage for you all today. I'm going to hang for a couple of seconds just to see if there's any comments or questions in the chat feature you can put in this live video. Also want to remind you all that we have launched our Ladies Leading Masterclass registration, and you can see that based on going to ladies-leading.com/masterclass. This class is really intended for early to mid-career women, focused on the 7 leadership competencies over the course of 8 months. We'll meet twice a month for about an hour and a half each time. And we'll focus on strengthening and deepening these competencies for you as a leader, so that you can advance, so that you can take on more leadership in your organization, maybe get a promotion or apply for a big new fancy job, whatever it is that you want to do. But this is really intended for women who are early to mid-career and want to take that next step and strengthen some of these competencies to help propel them to the next level of their career. Again, you can learn more at ladies-leading.com/masterclass. Registration is open, and the class starts virtually on March 10th. And so if you have any questions, feel free to just send me a private message on Facebook, or you can email us through the website as well. So thank you all for joining us again today. Please feel free to just send direct messages to our Facebook page if you have questions. Also, you're welcome to comment on this video after we're done with the live session, and we'll respond to your questions that way as well. Next week, we will talk on Ladies Leading Live about resilience. And so, again, as we talked about today, courage and resilience are so interconnected, but the important piece about resilience is failing and using failure as learning opportunities to propel our careers forward. So thanks all.